Lonely rancher saved Apache woman tied as prey for vultures, then love blossomed. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. New Mexico Territory, autumn of 1879. The land stretched out in harsh silence, a country stripped bare by wind and sun. The sky rose pale and endless, unbroken by clouds, as if heaven itself had been scoured clean. Below it, the ground was cracked and thirsty, a desert that offered nothing freely, neither water nor mercy. Jedediah Cole, known simply as Jed to the few who knew him at all, rode the boundary of his small spread on the back of a steady roan gelding. He was a rancher by trade, though not one blessed with much land or many cattle. What he owned was enough to keep a man alive, but not enough to make him rich, or keep him company. And truth be told, Jed preferred it that way. He had fought in the war back east, returned home to bury a wife and daughter in Illinois, and then drifted westward until there was nothing left but the wide silence of New Mexico. Here in the dust and stone, no one asked questions and no one gave answers.
A man could live with his ghosts without interference. That suited Jed fine. The afternoon sun rode high, throwing sharp light across the mesas. Jed's eyes swept the land the way they always did, trained by years of habit. He looked for broken fence posts, straying cattle, signs of raiders or drifters. Most days he found little more than dust devils spinning their short lives into nothing. But this day was different. On the ridge beyond a patch of stubborn yucca, something broke the stillness. At first Jed thought it a carcass left for coyotes, the desert's usual offering. Then he noticed the shape, too upright, too human. He reined his horse to a stop, the leather creaking as he leaned forward in the saddle. The figure was lashed to a stake, arms bound tight, head bowed forward. Jed's jaw tightened. Apache. A woman. Even from a distance, the scene carried the stench of cruelty. The desert had already begun its work, her skin blistered raw, dress torn, body slumped in exhaustion. Flies swarmed where the sun had opened wounds. Overhead, black-winged vultures wheeled in patient circles, waiting for death to finish its slow claim. Jed felt the weight of choice settle heavy on him. He had seen enough of men's brutality during the war, and he knew well enough that sometimes it was wiser to ride on, to leave another man's burden where it lay. Yet something rooted him to the spot. Perhaps it was the memory of his daughter, taken by fever years ago. Perhaps it was the whisper of Providence, faint but unyielding. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The words of the old psalm stirred in his mind, unbidden. He nudged the gelding forward. The vultures lifted on broad wings, circling higher, resentful of the interruption. Jed rode closer, his hand brushing the butt of the colt on his hip, though he saw no other riders, no ambush waiting. It was just the woman, the desert, and him. When he dismounted, the sand crunched beneath his boots, dry as bones. The air smelled of heat and dust and blood. Step by step, Jed approached until he stood over her. Her eyes flickered open, black, clouded, searching. She made no sound, only a faint shiver of breath through parched lips. The ropes held her cruelly, biting into her wrists. Jed knelt, drawing the knife from his belt. "Easy now," he muttered low, though he doubted she understood.
The blade sawed through the cord, and when it gave way, her body collapsed forward into his arms. She weighed almost nothing at all. Jed caught her before she struck the ground, one arm sliding beneath her shoulders, the other under her legs. Her head fell limp against his chest, skin hot with fever. She gave a faint groan, then nothing more. "Easy," he whispered, though the words were more for himself than for her. She was fragile, like something the desert had half claimed already, and he feared the slightest mishandling would finish what the sun had started. He carried her to the gelding, lifted her across the saddle, and tied her there as carefully as a man could. The roan shifted uneasily, sensing the strange weight, but Jed's steady hand on the reins calmed the animal. Mounting up behind her, he kept one arm firm around her waist to keep her upright. The trail back to his ranch cut through a shallow canyon, a place he had chosen years ago for its water and its solitude. A narrow stream still ran there, even in the worst of summers, and the canyon walls shielded against the endless wind.
Jed had built a rough cabin near its bend, a structure of pine logs and sweat, patched more times than he cared to count. It was no palace, but it was dry and it was his. They rode slowly. Every so often, Jed glanced down at her, making sure her chest still rose with breath. Her lips were split, cheeks burned raw, hair matted with sweat and dust. She clung faintly to consciousness, her hand twitching once against his coat before falling still. "You'll live," Jed muttered, though he had no certainty of it. He wasn't a doctor, just a rancher with enough hard experience to know when a body had a fighting chance. This one, she would need every scrap of strength left in her. By the time they reached the canyon, the sun had lowered, painting the rock walls in deep reds and shadowed purples. Jed guided the horse down the incline, careful not to jostle her more than necessary. The air grew cooler, a small mercy. At last the cabin came into view, a single-room dwelling with a sagging roof and smoke-stained chimney. Beside it stood a rough corral, half-mended, where the cattle grazed on sparse tufts of grass.
The sight of it had never struck Jed as anything more than survival, but tonight it looked almost like refuge. He dismounted, then gathered her once more into his arms. She felt lighter than she had on the trail, and for a brief moment he wondered if she'd slipped further away. Pushing through the door with his boot, he entered the cabin. Inside smelled of leather, wood smoke, and loneliness. The cot waited against the far wall, a stove crouched in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs stood silent near the window. Jed laid her gently on the cot, adjusting the thin pillow beneath her head. Her skin twitched at the touch, but her eyes never opened. Pulling a blanket over her, he stepped back, suddenly unsure. This was no place for an Apache woman, abandoned by her own people, bound to die in the desert. And yet she was here, and so was he. He lit a fire in the stove, stoked it until the cabin filled with a steady glow, then poured water into a tin cup. Sitting on the edge of the cot, he lifted her head just enough to touch the cup to her lips. At first nothing happened, but then she swallowed weakly, a few drops catching in her throat. "That's it," Jed said softly. "Drink what you can." The sound of the fire cracked, the wind moaned against the canyon walls, and somewhere outside a lone coyote howled into the dark. Jed stayed seated, watching her. He had questions burning in him, who she was, what had been done to her, why she had been cast out, but none of them seemed worth asking now. Survival came first. And for tonight, survival meant keeping watch over a stranger fate had placed in his care. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments. The cabin door creaked shut against the night, sealing them both inside. Jed set the lantern on the table, its light casting long shadows across the rough plank walls. For years the place had felt like nothing more than a shelter, 4 walls against the wind. Now, with a stranger lying half dead on his cot, the cabin seemed smaller, almost tense, as if it were holding its breath. He pulled a chair beside the bed and studied her in the firelight. Her face was drawn, lips cracked, cheeks blistered by sun and wind. The leather cords had bitten deep into her wrists, leaving angry welts. He fetched a basin, filled it with water, and dipped a cloth. When he laid the cool rag across her forehead, she flinched in her sleep, a faint tremor racing through her shoulders. Jed paused, waiting, then tried again, moving slower this time. The cloth rested against her skin, and after a moment her breathing eased. Still shallow, still ragged, but steadier than before. He pressed another strip to her wrists, washing away the dirt and blood. The water in the basin turned the color of rust. His thoughts flickered to the war years, to the makeshift tents where men coughed their last while surgeons worked with saws and whiskey. He had carried bodies then, too, brothers in uniform, and later his own wife, burning with fever, his daughter pale beside her. Jed shut the memory away. This was different. This woman was not gone yet. The fire snapped in the stove, filling the silence. Outside, the wind scoured the canyon, rattling the loose shutters. Jed sat back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. She was Apache, that much was plain. He had fought against men like her kin in his scouting days, had watched both sides bleed the same dust red.
But never had he seen cruelty quite like this, left staked in the open, abandoned not by enemies but by her own. He glanced at the window. The night pressed black beyond the glass. Whoever had left her might still be out there, or maybe they had no reason to return. Either way, he would keep the rifle close. Returning to the cot, he lifted her gently enough to bring the cup of water to her lips. At first she made no move, but when he tilted the rim, her throat worked, drawing in a swallow, then another. She coughed weakly, water spilling down her chin. Jed steadied her until the fit passed, then set the cup aside. "That's all for now," he murmured. She couldn't understand, but the sound of his voice seemed to soften the air. For the next hours he kept his vigil. Every so often he wrung the cloth in fresh water and replaced it against her skin. Sometimes she stirred, whispering words in her own tongue, broken fragments that meant nothing to him, yet carried the weight of fear. He didn't answer. He simply stayed. The hours dragged until the lantern burned low. Jed's body ached from stillness, but he refused the cot across the room.
His place was here, close enough to hear the faint rasp of her breath. When dawn finally edged the window gray, the woman was still alive. Jed let out a long, tired breath. He hadn't known if she would see morning. Now she had. And with the rising sun came a question heavier than any he'd carried in years. What to do with her now? By mid-morning, the light slanted across the cabin floor, golden and thin. Jed had dozed in the chair, one hand resting on the rifle propped at his knee, when the sound of movement drew his eyes open. She stirred against the cot, her head shifting on the pillow. For a long moment she lay still, then her eyes blinked open, dark, clouded, struggling to focus. The sudden awareness in them tightened Jed's chest. He set the rifle aside and raised his hands slightly, palms open, as if to say he meant no harm. Her gaze darted from him to the door, then back again. When she tried to push herself upright, her strength failed, and she fell back with a faint gasp. Jed leaned forward, but stopped short of touching her. "You're safe," he said quietly. His voice was rough from hours of silence. "No rope, no stake. Just a roof over you now." She swallowed, her lips working as if to form words. What came was little more than a whisper, brittle and unsure. "Why?" Jed hesitated. It wasn't the word he expected to hear first, but it was the one that mattered. He drew in a slow breath. "Because no one should die that way," he answered. "Nothing more, nothing less." Her eyes lingered on him, skeptical, wary. Then she shifted slightly, the blanket pulling up against her chest. After a moment she spoke again, her voice faint but clear enough. "Sana." Jed repeated it softly, careful with the syllables. "Sana." She gave the smallest nod, then watched him as if waiting for his offering in return. He touched a hand to his chest. "Jedediah Cole, Jed." The fire cracked in the stove, filling the quiet that followed. Outside, the gelding whinnied from the corral, a reminder that life carried on even when time seemed to stall inside these walls. Sana's eyes closed briefly, as though the effort of speaking had drained her. When she opened them again, her gaze fell on the tin cup at the bedside. Jed lifted it and held it toward her. This time, after a long pause, she reached with trembling fingers. Her hand brushed his as she took the cup, the touch quick, almost flinching, but not pulled away. She drank slow, each swallow careful, until the water was gone. Then she set the cup back into his hand. For the first time her shoulders eased, just slightly, as though some invisible weight had lifted for a moment. Jed sat back, studying her. He wanted to ask what had been done to her, why her people had left her, but the words stuck. Questions could wait. The fact that she was alive, speaking, was enough for this morning. He reached for a fresh cloth, dipped it into the basin, and pressed it gently against her wrist.
She didn't pull away this time. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy with fear. Instead, it carried something new. An unspoken agreement that both were still here, both still breathing, and for now, that was enough. The second night came colder. Jed fed cedar kindling into the stove, listening to the wind scrape along the canyon walls. The cabin filled with warmth, but not enough to chase the silence between them. Sana lay on the cot, half turned toward the fire, her blanket pulled tight. Jed sat in the chair opposite, sharpening his knife in slow strokes. It was she who spoke first. Her voice was low, almost drowned by the sound of steel on stone. "Your place." Jed paused, set the knife aside. "Mine," he said simply. "Built it up myself. No one else comes this far." Sana's dark eyes studied the rafters above her, then dropped back to him. "Alone?" Jed gave a short nod. "For years now." The words seemed to settle between them. Alone was a thing they both understood. After a long pause, she whispered, "They said I brought sickness." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "Old ones died, a child too. They blamed me." Jed leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't interrupt. "They tied me, took me, left me." Her throat worked hard as the confession forced its way out. Her gaze flickered to his face, waiting for judgment, then away again. Jed drew in a breath, slow and steady. "You weren't sick," he said. She shook her head once, sharp. "No." The flames popped in the stove. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Jed said, "I buried my wife and little girl back in Illinois. Fever took them both the same week. Nothing I could do. Doctor said it was the will of God." His jaw tightened. Felt more like God had turned his back. Sana shifted slightly, propping herself on one elbow. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing bruises dark against her skin. Her eyes softened as she searched his face. "And so, you came here?" Jed nodded once. "Wasn't nothing left for me there. Out here, quiet. Easier to live with ghosts when there's no one around to remind you." Sana let the words linger. She seemed to measure them carefully, as though testing their weight. "Ghosts follow," she said softly. Jed's gaze met hers across the dim room. He gave the faintest of nods. "Yeah, they do." Silence followed, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It carried the raw truth of two people stripped down by loss, two souls who had both been left behind, one by death, the other by betrayal. Outside, a coyote yipped, its cry carried thin on the night wind. Jed reached for the stove's kettle, poured hot water into a tin mug, and set it on the table within her reach. "Drink," he said. She hesitated, then pulled herself upright enough to take the mug. As the steam rose, she whispered, almost to herself, "Not cursed." Jed's voice was low but firm. "No, not cursed. Just left." For the first time since he found her, Sana's eyes did not look away. They held his, steady and searching, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. The morning broke clear and cold, the canyon walls etched in sharp lines of sunlight and shadow. Jed stepped outside early, as he always did, to check the corral. Frost clung to the rail posts, glittering faintly before the sun burned it away. The roan gelding nosed the ground for sparse grass, steam rising from its muzzle. When Jed returned, the cabin was no longer still. Sana had risen. She stood barefoot on the plank floor, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, sweeping the room with a crude broom made of pine twigs. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her breath shallow from weakness. But she worked as though she belonged to the space. Jed paused at the doorway, watching. He had not asked her to do a thing, yet here she was, pushing the dust into a corner, her dark braid falling loose over her shoulder. "You don't have to," he said. She looked up at him, expression unreadable, then bent again to her task. "I do," she replied quietly. Jed said nothing more. He set his hat on the peg and hung the rifle beside it. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a place lived in. Later that morning, he set a pot of beans and cornmeal to cook on the stove. Sana sat at the table, watching with wary curiosity. When the food was ready, he placed a bowl in front of her and stepped back. She glanced from the bowl to him, then slowly drew the spoon to her lips. Her hand shook, but she managed a few bites before setting it down. "Good," she murmured. Jed gave a short nod, then sat across from her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the stove. Yet the silence was different now, no longer a gulf, but a fragile bridge. In the afternoon, Jed showed her how to mend a torn strap on one of his saddlebags. He demonstrated slowly, his rough fingers guiding the awl through the leather, then handed it to her. Sana's hands were smaller but deft. She pulled the cord tight, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she tied the last knot, Jed examined the work and gave a single approving nod. "Strong," he said. Her lips pressed together, and though she didn't smile, something in her eyes softened. As the day waned, Jed stepped outside to split kindling. The rhythm of the axe against wood echoed through the canyon. When he returned, Sana had tidied the cot, folded the spare blanket, and set the bowls from lunch neatly on the shelf. It was nothing, really, and yet it was everything. That night, as the fire glowed low, Jed sat at the table repairing a bridle, while Sana rested on the cot, her head turned toward him. Their eyes met once in the quiet, a moment without words, without demand. Trust, he realized, was not built in sudden leaps. It was laid down in small stones, one upon another, until something strong enough to stand on began to rise. The days stretched into a rhythm neither had spoken aloud. Jed rose with the sun, as he always had, and now Sana rose not long after. She moved more steadily with each morning, her steps no longer faltering but sure across the cabin floor. One afternoon, Jed saddled the roan and motioned for her to follow. He carried the tool satchel. She carried nothing but the blanket pulled close around her shoulders. They walked the ridgeline where a section of fence had given way in the last storm. The posts leaned crooked, wire sagging toward the dirt. Jed drove a new stake into the ground, each blow of the hammer ringing sharp against the canyon's stillness. Sana crouched nearby, watching with sharp eyes. When he stretched the wire taut, she reached for the pliers without being asked. Her fingers worked clumsily at first, then more confidently, coiling the slack, twisting until the line held firm. Jed studied her hands as she worked. They were slender, scarred in places, but deft. When she finished, he gave a single nod. "Good hold." She exhaled softly, her shoulders easing. "I remember," she said. "My father, he taught me to bind deer sinew, same way." Jed looked at her, then at the wire between them. Two different worlds, one principle shared. They moved on together, mending post after post. The sun pressed down, but Sana did not complain. At the creek, she knelt to fill the water pail, her reflection rippling on the surface. Jed noticed the way she cupped the water in her hands before lifting the bucket, whispering a word in her own tongue. Back at the cabin, as Jed coiled the repaired wire, Sana pulled something from the fold of her dress, a string of beads, worn and cracked, the colors faded. She held it up, then touched it gently to the wire coil. "Different," she said, eyes steady on his. "But both bind, both hold." Jed regarded the beads a long moment. They were fragile, beautiful, and utterly unlike the plain tools he trusted. Yet he understood what she meant. That evening, Sana sat by the fire with the beads in her lap, weaving them into a loose braid of her hair. Jed worked on mending a stirrup strap at the table, the smell of oiled leather filling the cabin. Their tasks were different, their worlds far apart, yet the quiet felt whole. As the fire dimmed, Jed leaned back in his chair. He thought of the years he had spent keeping everything simple, functional, stripped of decoration or sentiment. But when he looked at the beads glinting faintly in her hair, he wondered if survival alone was enough. Sana caught his gaze, her expression calm, steady. She didn't speak, and she didn't have to. The contrast between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like the beginning of something joined.
The wind fell quiet that night, leaving the canyon still enough to hear the faint trickle of the creek beyond the ridge. Jed sat at the table with his tools spread before him, polishing the barrel of his Winchester. The familiar motion steadied his hands, though his mind wandered elsewhere. Across the cabin, Sana sat near the stove, the blanket draped loosely around her shoulders. Her dark hair caught the glow of the fire, the beads woven into her braid gleaming faintly. She wasn't sewing or sweeping or mending tonight. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on the flames as though searching for something hidden in their dance. After a long silence, she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, but edged with something fragile. "In the desert, I prayed." Jed's hands stilled on the cloth. He didn't look up right away. Prayer had not crossed his lips in years. Not since Illinois, not since he lowered his daughter's small body into the ground. Sana's eyes lifted to him. "I prayed someone would come. Not tribe, not enemy, just someone." Jed leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And you think I'm the answer to that?" She held his gaze, unflinching. "You came." The words hung heavy in the room, heavier than the rifle resting across his lap. Jed set the weapon aside, rubbing a hand across his beard. "I've asked God for plenty," he said finally. "Most of it went unanswered." Sana tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you stopped listening." The simple reply caught him harder than he expected. He turned to the stove, feeding a split log into the flames, just to give his hands something to do. The fire roared briefly, then settled into a steady glow. For a long time, neither spoke. The cabin was filled only with the sound of the crackling wood and the mule shifting restlessly in the corral outside. Then Sana said softly, almost like a whisper of wind, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Jed froze. The words struck him deep, familiar yet distant, like a song from childhood half remembered. He turned slowly to her. "You know that?" She gave a small nod. "Mission teacher once, long ago. I remembered." Her fingers touched the beads of her braid. "I was weary, burdened, and then you came." Jed swallowed hard. He had carried his ghosts west to escape them, but sitting there, he wondered if he had been led rather than lost. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Don't put me higher than I deserve, Sana. I ain't anyone's savior." She looked at him, steady as stone. "No, but you didn't ride past." The truth of it landed deep. Jed didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the quiet with her, the fire between them casting light against the cabin walls. For the first time in years, Jed did not feel entirely forsaken. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The evening came quiet, a hush over the canyon that made every sound inside the cabin sharp. Jed sat at the table, oiling the saddle straps, while Sana lingered near the stove, the blanket wrapped loose around her shoulders. For hours they had worked side by side without words, the rhythm of chores binding them more than speech ever could. But tonight, silence was heavy again, not with fear this time, but with something waiting. Sana sat, her knees drawn close beneath the blanket, her gaze fixed on the fire. At last she spoke, her voice soft, strained, but carrying weight that pulled Jed's head up. "If I go," she whispered, "I die." The words hung between them, sharp as wires stretched too tight. She lifted her eyes to him, dark and steady. "If I stay, do I belong?" Jed laid the strap aside, his hands still. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the stove. He had no answer ready. He had never thought of belonging, not for himself, not for anyone else. His life had been measured in solitude, the long days of labor, the long nights of ghosts. He rose slowly and crossed to the fire. Sana's shoulders stiffened as he neared, but she didn't pull away. He crouched so his eyes met hers at level. "You have a place here," he said finally. His voice was low, steady, as if every word needed to be laid like stone. "If you choose it." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The blanket slipped from one shoulder, revealing the thin line of bruises still healing. She pulled it close again, trembling. "Not tribe, not white. Where is my place?" Jed's jaw tightened. He thought of the town, of the looks a woman like her would draw, the muttered words in saloons, the prejudice carved deep as canyon stone. But he also thought of the empty chair at his table, the cot across the room that had never felt like home until she lay in it, the way the silence was no longer hollow with her in it. "You belong where you're wanted," he said, "and you're wanted here." Her breath caught, a sound small but breaking through years of exile. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of falsehood. What she saw there made her shoulders ease just slightly. Jed straightened and stepped back, giving her space. He picked up the strap again, though his hands lingered on it without working. He knew what had just passed between them could not be undone. She had asked the question. He had answered. There was no retreat now, no way to return to the silence of before. For the first time in years, Jed felt the weight of a choice that bound him not to survival, but to another life, another soul. And for Sana, the desert no longer held her fate. She had spoken the words aloud. If she stayed, she belonged. The night deepened, stars pricking through the black sky beyond the small window. Jed finished his work with the leather strap and set it aside. He sat near the table, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the stove's faint glow. Sana had been quiet since her question, her form still wrapped in the blanket on the cot. He thought she had fallen asleep until her voice came, soft and hesitant. "Jed?" He looked over. Her eyes were open, watching him. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter. "Can I sit beside you?" The words carried no demand, only uncertainty, but they struck him like a hammer. He wasn't sure if she asked for comfort, for safety, or for proof she wasn't alone. Maybe all three. Jed stood, slow and steady, and dragged the second chair closer to the stove. He tapped the seat gently. "Here." For a long moment she didn't move. Then, with careful steps, she crossed the room. The blanket trailed behind her, brushing the floorboards. She lowered herself into the chair, clutching the fabric close, her body angled toward the fire rather than him. The silence between them stretched. Jed didn't speak. He didn't reach. He simply sat, his hands resting open on his knees, letting her decide the distance. After a while, she let out a breath, a long, shuddering sound that seemed to drain years of fear from her chest. Her shoulders loosened. Her hands eased their grip on the blanket. Jed glanced at her. Her face, half lit by firelight, looked softer than it had since he first found her. Not a captive's face, not one awaiting judgment, but a woman's face learning she might be safe. He cleared his throat quietly. "You're not alone here." Her eyes flicked toward him, searching, then back to the flames. She nodded once, small but certain. Time passed in that quiet way only the frontier knew. Outside, the mule shuffled in the corral. The stove ticked as the fire settled lower. Inside, two people sat side by side, the width of a hand between them, but the distance of a lifetime had just been crossed. When Jed finally rose to set another log on the fire, Sabana leaned back in the chair, her eyes heavy but unafraid. She did not flinch when his shadow passed over her. Later, as she returned to the cot, she paused and looked back. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, but she didn't clutch it so tightly this time. "Thank you," she whispered. Jed gave a slow nod. No more words were needed. It was not closeness of desire, nor the pull of need. It was something quieter, more enduring. The first fragile thread of trust, stretched across the silence and holding fast. The third night came with a restless wind, rattling the shutters and seeping through the gaps in the logs. Jed sat on his bedroll near the hearth, oiling his rifle by lantern light. Sana lay on the cot, facing the wall. For a long time he thought she might sleep. But then her voice came, raw and low, as if dredged from a place she had long kept hidden. They did not speak. Jed looked up. Who? My family. She shifted slightly, the blanket falling from her shoulder. Her eyes shone dark in the lamplight, unblinking. They said nothing when they tied me. My mother, my brother, they watched. They let it be done. Her words cracked, breaking into fragments. She pressed a hand against her chest as though the memory were a blade still lodged there. I waited for someone to come forward, to say, no, not her. But no one spoke. They walked away. Jed set the rifle aside, his own chest heavy with the weight of her confession. The silence that followed seemed to ache against the walls. Sana drew the blanket tighter, but her trembling was plain. They said the desert would take me, and if not, then I was cursed. Better I be gone. Her voice faltered. She lowered her gaze to the rough planks of the floor, bracing for judgment from this man who had given her shelter. Jed rose slowly, his boots quiet on the boards, and crouched near the cot. She stiffened, but he didn't reach for her. He let the firelight carry his words instead. You are not cursed. Sana's eyes flicked to him, disbelief clouding them. Jed held her gaze, steady as stone. You're here, breathing, standing against the desert. Cursed don't survive what you did. The wind howled outside, but in the cabin his words held stronger. Sana's lips parted as if to protest, but nothing came. A tear slipped down her cheek, catching in the firelight. She turned her face away, yet her shoulders eased just slightly, as though a burden had shifted. Jed sat back on his heels, watching her. He thought of his own silence years ago, of standing powerless as fever claimed his wife, his daughter. Different pain, yet kin in its helplessness. He had never found words then. Tonight he had. Sana's breathing slowed, steadier now. She closed her eyes, her hand loosening against the blanket. Jed returned to his bedroll, but his eyes lingered on her long after the lantern dimmed. Outside, the canyon wind carried the ghosts away. Inside, for the first time, Sana had spoken the deepest wound and heard an answer strong enough to hold it. The fire burned low, casting the cabin in a dim orange glow. Jed lay on his bedroll near the hearth, half awake, listening to the steady hush of Sana's breathing across the room. He told himself sleep would come soon, but his body remained alert, every sense tuned to the fragile rhythm of this new life beside him. A shift of blankets caught his ear. He lifted his head. Sana was sitting up on the cot, the firelight touching her face. Her eyes were open, watchful, not with fear but with something deeper, an ache unspoken. She rose slowly, the blanket gathered around her shoulders and crossed the small space between them. Her bare feet whispered against the planks. She stopped beside his bedroll, her hands clutching the fabric tight. "Jed," she said softly. He pushed himself up on one elbow. Her voice held no tremor this time, only resolve. "I don't want to sleep alone." The words struck him silent. For years, he had kept the world at arm's length. For years, the only warmth he'd allowed was the fire in the stove. And now this woman, scarred by abandonment, was offering trust greater than any vow. Jed sat up fully, careful not to startle her. "Are you sure?" She nodded once, steady. "Yes." He shifted, giving space on the bedroll. Slowly, Sana lowered herself beside him. The blanket slipped as she settled, her shoulder brushing his arm. She did not flinch. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the stove. Then Sana leaned closer, her head resting lightly against his chest. Her breath was warm through the fabric of his shirt, uneven at first, then easing into a calm rhythm. Jed let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders, hesitant, then firmer when she did not pull away. His hand rested against her back, moving in slow, steady passes. It was not the urgency of hunger, nor the pull of desire. It was the quiet meeting of two exiles who had found, at last, a place to rest. Sana's fingers loosened on the blanket. "I thought I was gone," she whispered. "The desert, the ropes, no one came." She lifted her face, eyes shining in the dim light. "But you did." Jed pressed his forehead gently against hers. "And I'm here still." She closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her bones. For the first time since he had found her staked beneath the vultures, she let herself lean fully into another's embrace. The ghosts that haunted them both did not vanish that night, but they grew quieter, pushed back by the simple truth of two souls choosing to hold each other against the silence. The frost came early that year. Mornings painted the cabin railings silver, and the mule's breath rose like smoke in the crisp air. Life had taken on a rhythm. Chores at dawn, meals by the stove, evenings spent side by side in a silence that was no longer empty.
But one night, after the fire had burned low and the canyon lay still, Sana sat on the edge of the cot, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jed sensed something in her stillness, a tension that made the air feel brittle. He set aside the harness he had been mending. "What is it?" She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. Then she placed a hand against her stomach, fingers splayed as if unsure what she felt. "I think a child." The words came soft, fragile, like something that might shatter if spoken too loud. Jed froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he rose and came to her side, crouching so his eyes met hers. "You sure?" She shook her head slightly. "I've missed moons, and I feel different, but I don't know." Her voice trembled. "If it's true, I'm afraid." Jed's gaze softened. "Afraid of what?" Her throat worked as she whispered, "That it will be called cursed, like me. That it will carry their blame before it ever takes breath." Her eyes glistened, dark with fear she could not hide. Jed reached for her hand, steadying it with his own. "Listen to me, Sana. This isn't a curse." He pressed her palm firmly against her belly.
"It's life." She searched his face, desperate for certainty. "But what if?" He cut her gently, his voice firm. "No, not what if. The Lord himself said, 'For I know the plans I have for you,' declares the Lord. 'Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future.'" The words hung heavy in the room, stronger than the storm winds that howled outside. Sana's breath caught. She had heard scripture before, years ago from a mission teacher, but never had it landed so close to her heart. Her lips parted, trembling. "Hope and a future?" Jed nodded. "That's what he promised, and I believe it now. With you, with this child." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they fell not from despair, but from a fragile kind of joy. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Her voice was a whisper. "Then maybe I was not left to die after all." Jed's arm wrapped around her, holding her steady. "No, you were spared for this." The fire cracked, casting light across the cabin walls. The ghosts of the desert, of betrayal, of loss, they were still there. But for the first time, they no longer ruled. In their place stood something new, the promise of life, fragile yet unshakable. The trail into town felt longer than usual, though it was only a few miles. Sana rode beside Jed on the roan, her braid tied with a strip of leather he had cut for her, the beads woven through glinting faintly in the sun. She wore the deer-hide dress she had mended with her own hands, patched carefully until it held together. Her posture was straight, but her gaze stayed lowered as the settlement came into view. Cold Brush Junction was no city, only a scattering of buildings. A saloon, a general store, a small station for riders. Yet as the two rode in, conversation slowed, eyes followed. A white rancher, weathered and hard, and an Apache woman at his side. Jed felt the weight of every stare. He glanced at Sana, her lips pressed tight, her shoulders rigid beneath the dress. She braced herself as though expecting stones instead of looks. He leaned close, voice low but firm. "You're with me. Let them look." They dismounted outside the general store. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and flour dust. The shopkeeper, a broad man with a limp, stiffened the moment his eyes fell on Sana. Jed set his list on the counter. "Need flour, beans, soap, salt, and a kettle if you've got one." The man's eyes flicked between Jed and Sana. He didn't move. "She with you?" Jed's jaw tightened. He didn't hesitate. "She's my wife." The word landed like a hammer. The room seemed to pause, the weight of it echoing louder than the rattle of wagons outside. The shopkeeper blinked, then cleared his throat and began filling the order without another word. Sana's eyes lifted to Jed, wide, searching. He met them steady, no flinch, no shame. When they stepped back outside, she stopped him beside the mule. Her hand caught his sleeve, grip strong despite her trembling. "You said, wife." Jed turned to face her, the autumn wind tugging at his coat. "I meant it." Her lips parted, her breath unsteady. "You never asked." He took her hand, rough palm against her smaller one. His voice was plain, certain. "Sana, will you marry me?" Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice did not shake. "Yes, I already have." The moment was simple, without preacher or paper, but it bound them more than law could. In the street, people still stared, still whispered, but Sana no longer lowered her gaze.
For the first time, she stood beside a man who did not hide her, who did not leave her. Jed lifted their joined hands, rough and strong, a silent declaration against the world's scorn. "You belong here," he said, and she believed him. The prejudice of the town lingered like dust in the wind, but it no longer mattered. The point of no return had been crossed, and in the open light of day, before men who would never understand, Jed and Sana had chosen each other. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. Winter settled over the canyon like a heavy quilt. Each morning frost clung to the railings, sparkling pale before the sun crept high enough to melt it away. The creek ran slow and shallow, its edges crusted with ice. The mule's breath rose in white clouds, the sound of it steady against the stillness. Inside the cabin, warmth gathered around the stove where logs crackled and smoked. Sana stood barefoot on the planks, wrapped in a heavier dress she had sewn from the deer hide Jet had traded weeks before. It fit her well, hugging her hips, falling neatly over her swelling belly.
Not much yet, but enough that her hands often lingered there without thought, a quiet acknowledgement of the life growing within. Jed sat at the workbench, rubbing oil into the Henry rifle. His eyes, though focused on the task, drifted often toward her. It had taken him time to accept that the ghosts of Illinois would never leave him, but now he found their voices softer, dimmer, drowned by the rhythm of this new life. Serena glanced over her shoulder. "Too much oil," she said softly. Jed raised a brow. "And what do you know about rifles?" "Nothing," she admitted, turning back to stir the pot of stew. "But I know when a man's hands wander more than his eyes." He chuckled, the sound low, almost foreign in his own throat. "Fair enough." Later, she finished stitching a pair of tiny moccasins from scraps of hide. She held them up to the firelight, smiling faintly. "The heel is wrong, crooked." Jed leaned forward, squinting. "Babies walk crooked anyway, don't matter." She smiled wider, setting the moccasins on the shelf above the stove, beside the carved spoon he had made weeks earlier. The two small objects looked right together, as if they belonged. By mid-afternoon, they loaded the mule for a ride into Cold Brush Junction. It had been months since Sana had stepped beyond the canyon walls, and her grip on Jed's arm was tight as they entered town. But this time, she did not bow her head as low. She wore the beads in her braid and let the winter sun catch them. The stares came, as they had before, but Jed's hand never left hers. At the general store, he placed their list on the counter: flour, beans, salt, and cloth for the child.
The shopkeeper hesitated, then nodded. Sana stood beside Jed, steady, her gaze forward. When they left, no word had been spoken against them, and yet a battle had been won. Back at the cabin, Jed built a second cot from pine boards. When he showed it to Sana, she laughed softly. Too soon. The baby won't need it for many moons. Jed rubbed the back of his neck, sheepish. Suppose I wanted to be ready. They dismantled it together, the sound of their laughter mingling with the crack of boards and the crackle of firewood. That evening, Sana sat wrapped in a wool blanket on the porch, her belly rounder beneath her dress. The sky stretched wide, stars burning bright against the black. Jed whittled a toy from cedar, his knife moving slow and steady. "You never told me," Sana said suddenly, "her name." Jed stilled. "Whose?" "Your daughter, the one you lost." His hand tightened on the knife. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said, voice rough, "Emma. Emma Wade." Sana let the name settle into the night air. Then she looked out at the stars. "Then this one will carry her name too." Jed's throat ached. He set the knife aside and reached for her hand, pressing it to his lips. They sat together in silence, the night folding around them like an old familiar coat. The ghosts had not vanished, but they no longer ruled the cabin. Where silence once meant sorrow, it now meant peace. By late March, the frost loosened its grip. The canyon, once hushed and brittle, began to stir with signs of spring. Thin shoots of green pressed through the rocky soil near the stream. Birds returned, their calls sharp against the morning air. Jed worked the ground near the cabin, turning earth with a spade he had traded for in town. Sana knelt beside him, arranging a circle of stones for an herb bed. Her belly had grown, rounding beneath her dress, and Jed often found himself glancing up from his work to watch her. Each time she caught him, and each time she gave a small smile that warmed him more than the sun. They planted carrots, turnips, and beans, laying hope into the soil with every seed. Sana smoothed the dirt with her hands, whispering in her own tongue as if blessing the earth. Jed didn't ask the words, he only listened, struck by the reverence in her tone. Inside the cabin, life had shifted too. Sana kept stores neatly packed, rabbit pelts wrapped tight, the shelves lined with jars of dried beans and berries. The cabin smelled of sage she had gathered and hung to dry. What had once been a place of exile now breathed like a home, carrying both of their marks. One evening, Sana sat at the table sewing a new dress for herself, her hands steady, the fabric soft against her lap. Jed carved at a block of cedar, shaping it slowly into a small horse. When Sana glanced at him, he lifted it with a half smile. "For the baby." Her fingers stilled. "A toy?" He nodded. "Every child should have one." Sana's eyes softened. She set aside the fabric, watching him work. "You'll be a good father," she said quietly. Jed swallowed, the words striking deep. "I'll try." She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "That is enough." Later, as night pressed in, Sana lay back on the cot, one hand resting against her belly. Jed sat beside her, the lamplight casting a glow across the room. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I dream they come back, my people. They say I must go." Jed's jaw tightened. "Would you want to?" Sana hesitated, her hand circling slowly over her stomach. "Part of me wants them to want me, but not enough to return." She turned her gaze to him. "I belong where I am seen, where I am safe." Jed leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then you belong here, with me." She closed her eyes, exhaling slow, as if releasing the last threads of doubt. The wind outside shifted, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Inside, the fire burned steady. Sana whispered into the quiet. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Jed's hand stilled against hers. He knew the words, knew them from long ago, when faith had seemed distant. Hearing them now, spoken by her, they didn't sound like something lost. They sounded like something found again. "You believe that?" he asked. Her eyes opened, steady and clear. "I do. Do you?" Jed looked at her, at the life they had built, at the child she carried, and for the first time in years, he felt the answer rise without hesitation. Yes. Sana smiled faintly, her hand guiding his back to her belly. Together, they sat in the quiet of the cabin, the weight of faith settling not as a burden, but as peace. Outside, the canyon carried their silence, not empty as it once had been, but full of promise, of hope, of the future that waited just beyond the spring. Stories like Jed and Sana's remind us that the Wild West was not only about guns and gold, but about lonely hearts, quiet courage, and the simple hope of belonging. Perhaps you, too, have known what it feels like to be cast aside, or to carry ghosts that whisper in the silence of night. And maybe, like them, you've discovered that love, trust, and faith can build a home even in the harshest wilderness. When we share tales such as this, we are not just telling history, we are preserving memory, honoring those who endured, and reminding ourselves that God's grace reaches even the most forgotten places. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. And if you wish to keep walking these dusty trails of memory, subscribe and join us for more true Wild West stories, where faith, hope, and humanity still ride strong.